very, very important to people.
And we're always up for a laugh on this show.
God, honestly, you'd think there were no problems in the world.
Real Britain, every Saturday on GB News.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
to each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland, Wales
and Northern Ireland. On TV,
on radio and online.
We're proud to be
the People's Channel, Britain's
news channel.
Good morning, this is To The Point on GB News, live on your TV, radio and online. I'm with you until midday with a show jam-packed full of today's biggest stories, lots of discussion and indeed expert guests. So make sure you get in touch with your views as usual on GBviews at gbnews.uk. I'll be getting to those right throughout the show, but first, let's have a look at those latest headlines.
Well, a very good morning. It's a couple of minutes past 10. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date today on GB News. The Manston Migrant Processing Centre in Kent is fit for purpose, according to the Immigration Minister. Robert Jenrick says the facility has been overwhelmed by the huge numbers of asylum seekers crossing the Channel. Around 4,000 people are thought to be at the centre, which is built to hold a maximum of 1,600. Well, he also defended the Home Secretary after she described the influx of migrants as an invasion, saying she used the word to describe the sheer scale of the challenge being faced. Well, the UK is being warned that household budgets could be further squeezed, with tax rises expected for years to come. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor are under pressure to balance the books, with up to £50 billion needed to fill a black hole in the public finances. The Daily Telegraph says a combination of 50% tax rises and 50% spending cuts is being considered. A Treasury source told the paper it's going to be rough and everyone will need to contribute to maintain public services. Well, meanwhile, there'll be some additional support for people struggling with their energy bills. National Grid have announced it's launched a £50 million fund to help people over the next 2 winters. The money will go to charities that offer emergency financial support to those using prepaid meters, as well as advice on payments and debt. Well, that energy support comes as BP announces profits that more than doubled in the last quarter. Profits surged to £7.1 billion, compared with £2.9 billion a year earlier. The oil giant also confirmed it will be hit by a windfall tax on its UK operations, which it will pay this year. Fireworks were thrown at cars last night in scenes that the leader of Dundee City Council has described as absolutely disgusting. Video was posted on social media showing young people lighting fires on roads, blocking cars and forcing them to drive over grass verges. There were also reports of bricks being thrown at vehicles, and images show police in riot gear. Well, Councillor John Alexander likened the behaviour to those in a war-torn nation and said it reflected poorly on the Kirkton community. In South Korea, the number of people killed in the Halloween crush at the weekend has risen to 156. Most of the victims were in their teens and 20s. As the country tries to calm public outrage, families are being encouraged to collect items like shoes and bags that were left behind. The police chief has admitted crowd control in the area was inadequate and says he feels responsible for the tragic event. 13,000 online child sex offences may have been recorded since the online safety bill was delayed in July. That's according to the NSPCC. The charity, which is basing its estimations on previous Home Office data, says the figures should serve as a wake-up call to the government. It says there's overwhelming public support for the legislation to be brought back. The Shadow Culture Secretary, Lucy Powell, is urging the government to pass the bill before Christmas.
We want to see this bill on the statute book as quickly as possible, and that's why I'm setting aside some of my criticisms in order to try and work with the government to get this done. But they really do need now to meet me halfway and actually bring back the bill so that we can do the very, very final stages of it, get it through the Commons before Christmas and into the Lords before the entire bill potentially collapses next year because it's run out of time.
Farmers are warning turkey supplies could be affected this Christmas following the UK's biggest outbreak of bird flu. They say the current situation is unbelievably bad, describing it as the foot and mouth of the poultry industry. Bird keepers in England will be required to house their birds indoors from the 7th of November to help tackle the spread of the virus. You're now up to date on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now, back to the point.
A very good morning to you. This is To The Point on GB News with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV, radio and online. I've got a really great show for you lined up today to kickstart your day, so here's what's coming up. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has hit back at critics and defended her record as Home Secretary. She's come under fire for describing the influx of migrants into southern England as an invasion. Well, what do you think? Get in touch and let me know. And our Home and Security editor, Mark White, has an exclusive look at the intersection of organised crime and illegal migration. How have Albanian gangs become so prominent in Britain? And the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, is warning Russia that they will face severe consequences if it uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine. As Russia continues its bombardment of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, is Putin becoming increasingly desperate? Well, I have all of that coming up and much more across the programme. And remember, get in touch throughout it all. gbviews@gbnews.uk is the address to email. Now, the Home Secretary says she is the victim of a political witch hunt and defends her record in that role. In the House of Commons last night, Suella Braverman addressed both the migrant crisis and her handling of sensitive Home Office documents. Braverman insisted that mistakes had indeed been made, but said she wouldn't apologise for the things she hadn't done. Addressing the situation at the Manston Processing Centre, she said that she never blocked the use of hotels to ease pressure on the processing centre there. She came under fire for describing the influx of migrants into southern England as an invasion.
The British people deserve to know which party is serious about stopping the invasion on our southern coast and which party is not.
The Home Secretary there. Well, joining me now is GB News political editor Darren McCaffrey, live from Downing Street. And Darren, I know you've been standing there as the morning's cabinet meeting has been going on. Have we seen any ministers walking out of that shining black door yet this morning?
No, none emerging thus far, so the cabinet meeting's lasting a little longer than it did last week, which I think was only around 25 minutes. Clearly, the news being dominated this morning by Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, who, interestingly, very interestingly, Tom, actually, most ministers kind of try and dive into the door pretty quickly. Some of them, their armoured cars turn up at the door, so you can't really get a look. Suella Braverman, when she turned up in Downing Street, less than an hour ago, actually got out of the car over here and very deliberately walked up essentially the entire street, wanted to be seen today. She is having a row she very much wants to have today about the use of the word invasion. She claims it is an entirely accurate representation of what is happening on the south coast of England. It's backed up by her supporters, many who feel that there's a political witch hunt against her. But she wants to appear tough on immigration. She wants to appear as someone who's not going to pussyfoot around when it comes to language around immigration. She's willing to have this row, and hence she'd be perfectly happy that we're all talking about the use of immigration, of an invasion this morning. Now, that does not mean that everyone is terribly comfortable with that word in and outside of government. Robert Jenrick, who's the immigration minister, who also sits around that cabinet table, said on the radio this morning that while the Home Secretary was conveying to the public the sheer scale of the challenge, before admitting that invasion is not a word he would use, you have to choose your language carefully, he said, which may be a hint that actually the Prime Minister might be a little uncomfortable with the use of that word. But as I say, in the end, this is a row the Home Secretary would be willing to have. Additionally to all these continued questions, aren't there, about whether the Home Secretary was involved in blocking hotels that may have led to the increase in the numbers that we saw in Manston in that immigration processing centre over the weekend, where essentially conditions became unacceptable. Now, again, LBC is reporting this morning that a senior Home Office source claims that the Home Secretary refused to approve those hotel bookings for migrants because they were in Tory areas. It follows, again, some unsourced reports from the Home Office yesterday to Bloomberg that was the case. Now, the Home Secretary strenuously denied it yesterday in Parliament. She insists that she did not block hotel rooms for these migrants. In the end, if they keep remaining as unnamed sources, the Home Secretary is always going to win this argument, because she's willing to fess up in Parliament and say, you know what, I didn't do this, I deny this, this is misreporting. So I think we're not going to see a smoking gun in all of this unless some of these sources publicly name themselves. Whether they do or not, I don't know. But if they do, that would increase the pressure on the Home Secretary. So in many ways, this is a big fundamental problem, though, for Suella Braverman, in the sense that lots of her predecessors may not have used quite such strong language, but frankly, they've talked about trying to sort out this mess for many years. They've managed not to do so. Can this Home Secretary really sort this out? It's a big ask, it's a big challenge, and at the moment, you'd have to suggest on previous form, it seems pretty unlikely, Tom.
Really intractable issue there. Of course, it's been growing for quite some years now too. We'll have to wait and see, I suppose, in terms of what the Home Secretary might announce in the coming days. But for now, Darren McCaffrey, thank you for joining us live there from Downing Street this morning. Let's move this conversation on now. I'm delighted to be joined by Anne Widdecombe, the former Conservative Minister, of course, and former Shadow Home Secretary as well. We'll be speaking to Anne Widdecombe, of course, about Suella Braverman's comments about whether this invasion, this term invasion, was inflammatory or not. I believe we can speak to Anne Widdecombe now. Thank you so much for joining us. Firstly, this question of invasion, the language of invasion, was that the right thing to say?
Well, it was a metaphor. I mean, she was talking about being overwhelmed by sheer force of people coming here from elsewhere. And it was a metaphor. You might say, I've got a family invasion this weekend. You're not being rude about your family. You're just using a metaphor. But what really strikes me about that is Robert Jenrick openly contradicting the Home Secretary and saying it's not a word he would have used. Now, when will they get over this? He should have his knuckles very severely rapped by the Chief Whip and be told, that's it. You know, you don't get another chance. You don't contradict your boss in public. What is the matter with them that they can't get basic party discipline? What is the matter?
It's interesting that this sort of double act of Braverman and Jenrick seems to have been deliberately concocted by the new Prime Minister to sort of perhaps balance each other out. Robert Jenrick is known to be someone perhaps on the more liberal wing of the Conservative Party, Suella Braverman certainly on the more conservative wing. Perhaps this sort of double act two-team is precisely what the Prime Minister wanted to do in terms of bringing that balance to the Home Office.
That's fine if what we're talking about is working out policy. That's absolutely fine. I'm all for having different voices in a department, because that's where you get much better discussion. And I say that from solid experience. It's always as well to have at least one dissenting voice there who will put another point of view. That's not quite what I'm pointing out. I'm pointing out that this guy has publicly contradicted or criticised his boss for the use of a word. Now, if he doesn't want to use that word, that's absolutely fine. But what he shouldn't do is say so. Just not use it, mate. But don't talk about how you're not going to use it. What's the matter with them?
Now, I heard Robert Jenrick this morning, and I think, to be fair to him, he seemed to be walking on a bit of a tightrope. To one extent, he was trying to not criticise his boss. He was saying it was showing the strength of feeling, but then, of course, he said he had not used that word himself. Perhaps, in your view, you would have wanted him to lean in more and get behind this more combative, perhaps, language in order to take on this issue head on.
I don't even think he needed to defend the language. I think he could have said, you know, as he did, say she was trying to express, you know, the sheer force. but then full stop, not go on to say how he wouldn't have used it. That's where the trouble lies. And they've got into this habit, the Conservative Parliamentary Party. They just contradict each other. Now, it doesn't matter on the backbenches, matters in government. And I think, and Rishi Sunak needs to get a grip on this as well as the Chief Whip. They need to all sing from the same hymn sheet. And if somebody says something, I ran into this problem as a minister frequently. Either I'd said something or somebody else had said something, and we didn't agree, and we just found a form of words which did not give the appearance of a contradiction. And, if you're a minister, you take that in with your mother's milk. It's called collective responsibility, Mr. Jenrick.
Interesting stuff there. There, of course, was another big subject that dominated the Home Secretary's statement in the Commons last night. And, of course, that is her handling of documents, her sending of 6 separate emails to a private email, Gmail address, and indeed missending them to at least one individual who was not meant to receive that sensitive information. In your view, did the Home Secretary explain herself well enough?
Yes, as far as I'm concerned, have you never hit a wrong button? I've certainly hit a wrong button before now. It's something very easy to do. She explained it. She paid the penalty for it under the previous administration by resigning. She's apologised for it. She doesn't have to go any further. This has now just become a game that is being played by the opposition and by some parts of the press and media, and she just needs to withstand that. Unfortunately, I think she is well able to withstand it, and on this occasion, I think she's got a PM that will stand behind her. Well, he must do, because he made the appointment. He'll look very silly if he doesn't.
That's a really fascinating point to end on there, how resolute the new Prime Minister is. In your view, you are saying that you think that Rishi Sunak will stick by his Home Secretary. He is willing to weather the political heat that is coming from much of the media and the opposition on this issue.
Well, if he doesn't, he's going to lose minister after minister, because there's always something that you can trip somebody up on, and all you have to do is to keep on and on and on about it. And if he sends a signal that he gives in to that sort of pressure, then that sort of pressure will come thick and fast. He needs to stand up to it now in order to prevent it in the future. I'm sorry, what we haven't been discussing is the actual problem that we've got down there across on the shores. We haven't been discussing that, and I'm rather sorry about that, because I think it is most unfair to blame Suella when she's only been there 5 minutes. This problem has been building up for decades, and I underline decades.
Absolutely, and we have been producing a special report this morning on particularly the Albanian issue of these gangs that could take up almost half of those coming illegally across the channel, something we will be exploring much more throughout this morning. We'll have to leave it there for now, but Anne Widdecombe, always appreciate your views this morning. Of course, former Shadow Home Secretary and Conservative Minister. Thank you for joining us. Well, after the break, we'll be looking at those Albanian gangs. Our Home and Security editor, Mark White, has an exclusive report about the intersection of immigration and organised crime. That after this.
Alex Deacon here with your latest weather update from the Met Office. A blustery day out there, quite as lively as the winds were overnight, but still gusty conditions with some sunny spells, but also plenty of showers. Low pressure systems dominating. One is clearing away that brought all the very strong winds across the far south through the course of last night. Following on behind, we have weather fronts bringing bands of showers into Wales and southwest England. Still some wet weather across the Northern Isles. That'll persist for most of the day, but elsewhere something a bit brighter, but it is still very blustery, especially across southern parts of England and Wales, and particularly near these showers, which will spread into the Midlands and parts of eastern England later. Not too many for Scotland, the east of Northern Ireland, far north of England. Many here will have a mostly dry afternoon. Still pretty mild for the time of year, but obviously it doesn't feel all that mild when the showers come along. And more of these heavy showers around through this evening as well. I don't think anywhere immune from a downpour. Still fairly blustery initially, but the winds will actually ease overnight. And through the second half of the night, the showers die out as well. And so it will turn quite chilly. Temperatures well down into single figures in rural spots. So a fresh start to Wednesday. Generally a bright and sunny start for quite a few, but that doesn't last. Another weather system comes in from the west. Fairly angry one this, going to bring some very gusty winds around the coast of Wales, Northern Ireland, northwest England and into southern Scotland. Some heavy rain for Scotland and Northern Ireland too. So we do have Met Office yellow warnings in place. That band of rain will be pretty intense, but it will move through fairly quickly thanks to the very gusty winds. As I said, it could cause some disruption. So we do have Met Office yellow warnings in place. That rain will spread into eastern parts of England as we go through Wednesday evening and may well linger into Thursday across East Anglia and the southeast. Could be quite a wet day here on Thursday. Elsewhere, a mixture of sunshine and showers. Friday looks like being a dry and a bright day for most before more rain moves in on Saturday.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Good morning, it's 10:24 and this is To The Point with me, Tom Harwood. We're live on your TV, online and on your radio this morning too. And to our top story, where we're looking at the goings-on in the Channel, and particularly this morning, looking at Albanian criminal gangs, which are on the rise in the UK and are shipping hundreds of millions of pounds in criminal proceeds back to their home country every year. Official sources have told GB News that much of the surge in Albanians arriving across the English Channel on small boats is being orchestrated by these gangs. Many are being used to manage cannabis farms across the UK, as Albanian criminals have now taken control of most of the country's cannabis trade, dominated previously by Vietnamese gangs. Our Home and Security editor Mark White has this exclusive report.
Albanian gangs are the dominant force in organised crime across the UK. We've been told that Albanian crime groups are shipping hundreds of millions of pounds in criminal proceeds back to Albania every year. A number of different businesses, like car washes and barber shops, are often used to launder the proceeds of crime. But in truth, the vast majority of the money they make from their criminal endeavours is simply carried back to Albania by hand or in vehicles. Recently, border officials seized £300,000 bound for Albania in luggage at a UK airport. In another incident, £500,000 was found hidden inside a van at a UK port. Albanian crime gangs now control the majority of cannabis farms across the UK. They've taken over much of the cannabis cultivation trade from Vietnamese crime groups, with most of the Albanian cannabis farms concentrated in the north. But in pretty much every part of the country, you'll find Albanians are the dominant group involved in cannabis cultivation, as we found out recently in Suffolk. Is this what you're seeing time and again increasingly now, like other forces, that the Albanian organised criminal gangs are moving into these areas?
No, they are. They certainly seem to be on the up. They seem the dominant ones at the moment.
The trade in cannabis is largely self-contained amongst Albanian criminals here, with less control from crime bosses in their home country. In the south, they still control most of the cocaine trade, which is largely overseen by crime lords back in Albania. Across the UK, there has been a number of recent arrests of Albanians suspected of involvement in cross-channel people smuggling. Much of the surge in Albanians arriving by small boats lately is, we're told, being orchestrated by Albanian criminal gangs who want those people to work for them. Most of the people smuggling trade is still being controlled by Kurdish criminal gangs, but they are increasingly working in tandem with Albanian crime groups, who are advertising and arranging for people from the Western Balkan nation to head for northwest France before handing them over to the Kurdish gangmasters. Social media is a massive tool the Albanians have been using to good effect to attract their fellow countrymen and women. We've learned that the National Crime Agency has persuaded social media companies to remove 1,700 such videos in recent months. But for every one they delete, many more pop up, persuading Albanians to cross the channel and enter the UK's illegal economy.
Mark White reporting for us there, and I'm delighted to say that he joins us now in the studio. And Mark, how have these Albanian gangs managed to become so prominent?
Well, they've always been pretty prominent within the UK anyway in terms of their criminal activity. But they're growing and they are taking over more and more territory. They seem to have had, from what I've been told, a relatively bloodless takeover of the cannabis farms from the Vietnamese crime groups. So they've not been sort of fighting and killing each other for them by and large. But they seem to have certainly taken over many of the cannabis farms, particularly in the north of the country. But pretty much anywhere you go across the UK, you'll find cannabis farms that are now being run by Albanians. And what we've been told is that many of the Albanians who are coming across the English Channel in these small boats are coming, it's being orchestrated by criminal gangs, and they are being used in many cases to act as what they call farmers, to look after these cannabis farms. And others are doing other business for criminal gangs here in this country. Now, that's not to say that every single Albanian coming across is a criminal. That's absolutely not the case. But many, many are, and that is a real concern. And that's one of the points that Suella Braverman was trying to highlight in the Commons yesterday when she was shouted down for saying that this was an invasion and we should acknowledge that not everyone coming across the channel is a refugee.
And of course, Albania is acknowledged as a safe country. It's not a country striven by internal conflict or war. It clearly has a lot of issues, a lot of criminal issues, but none that would justify asylum claims, you would have thought. What proportion of those coming across the channel, and we know that around 40,000 have come this year so far, what proportion are actually coming from Albania?
Well, increasingly a very significant proportion. In recent months, 60% of those on the small boats have been from Albania. Now, that phenomenon of the Albanians coming across on the small boats is something that's grown particularly in the sort of back half of this year. So earlier in the year and last year, it wasn't quite so many. But already, because of the 60% in the last few months, it's pushed the number who've arrived here to 12,000 out of 40,000, which, when you consider the tiny nation that Albania is, to see that now in recent months, it is the dominant nation, the predominant nation on board these small boats, it's absolutely a concern. And it's a poor country, without a doubt. It has its troubles. But as you say, it's not at war. On the face of it, the government say that the vast majority of those coming from Albania wouldn't stand the test of qualifying for asylum. But of course, what happens as well, Tom, is when they come across, they're schooled as part of a very efficient service, both from the people smugglers and, of course, from immigration lawyers when they get here. I mean, they're told by the people smugglers, for instance, to say that they're victims of human trafficking in many cases, so on modern slavery. So then they have to, those claims have to be taken seriously and investigated, and they can be here for a long time.
And that takes so much time.
Yeah.
And of course, we've seen that the processing times have really delayed a lot of these claims, have created a lot of issues in a lot of these processing facilities. But we do have a deal with Albania now. We have had for the last year a deal with Albania. Why are so few people being sent back when we do have the legal means to send them back?
Well, the government say that 1,000 Albanians have been sent back over the past year, but many of them are actually criminals who have served prison terms and have then been returned back to Albania. Few of them are actually those who are arriving on small boats because of the issues, as I say, because many of them are told to say that they're the victims of modern slavery. Others increasingly are now starting to claim asylum. And what happens, again, according to officials, is they're put into these hotel rooms, increasing numbers of hotels that are being requisitioned by the Home Office. And within 2 or 3 days, the Albanians, it's not really true of the other nationalities, but many of the Albanians just disappear. And they're believed to have been picked up by criminal gangs to work in the sectors that I said before, like of cannabis farms.
Really, really troubling situation. No doubt much more for the Home Office to get dealing with. Whether or not they'll be given space to, however, is another question. Keep your views coming in, of course, on everything that we've been discussing. gbviews@gbnews.uk is the address to email. Now, after the break, Russia's targeted Ukraine's civilian infrastructure with heavy bombardment yesterday, and Foreign Secretary James Cleverly warned of severe consequences for Russia if they use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. We're going to be live in Kiev to get an update on the conflict there. But before that, let's look at this morning's other news.
Very good morning, 10:33. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. The UK is being warned that household budgets could be further squeezed, with tax rises expected for years to come. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor are under pressure to balance the books, with up to £50 billion needed to fill a black hole in the public's finances. The Daily Telegraph says a combination of 50% tax rises and 50% spending cuts is being considered. Meanwhile, there will be some additional support for people struggling with their energy bills. National Grid has announced a £50 million fund to help them over the next 2 winters. The money will go to charities that offer emergency financial support to those using prepaid meters, as well as advice on payments and debt. Well, that energy support comes as BP announces profits that more than doubled in the last quarter, surging to £7.1 billion, compared with £2.9 billion a year earlier. The oil giant has confirmed it's going to be hit by a windfall tax on its UK operations, which it will pay this year. Farmers are warning turkey supplies could be affected this Christmas following the UK's biggest outbreak of bird flu. They're describing the situation as the foot and mouth of the poultry industry. Bird keepers in England will be required to house their animals indoors from the 7th of November to try to help tackle the spread of the infection. TV, online, DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.531 and €1.1593. The price of gold is currently £1,431.38 per ounce, and the FTSE 100 is at 7,203 points.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne. At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akua, on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today.
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News.
On Mark Dolan tonight, we have a simple plan, which is to inform, stimulate and entertain in equal measure. It's all about getting your opinions on the national television airwaves. I love my viewer emails, mark@gbnews.uk. So do join me every Friday, Saturday and Sunday for big guests, big opinions and a big presenter. 6'5", don't you know? See you then on GB News.
It's 10:37. This is To The Point with me, Tom Harwood, here on GB News. We're live on your TV, online and on your radio this morning. Now, next today, Michael Gove, who recently returned to the role of Secretary of State for Levelling Up, has abandoned the government plans for a formal definition of Islamophobia. This was met with some backlash, with Labour MP Afzal Khan said, quote, British Muslims are the victims of the highest proportion of hate crime every year, yet Tories simply do not care. Well, is that quite true? Joining me now to talk about this in more detail is Dr. Rakib Ehsan, a social policy analyst. Thank you for joining me. I suppose there's a bit of an accused double standard here, because, of course, when the government adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, that was widely praised. Having a clear definition of what anti-Semitism is was seen to be a very good thing. Why is it not so true when it comes to Islamophobia, in your view?
Well, firstly, Tom, I don't really like using the term Islamophobia. I much prefer anti-Muslim prejudice. Now, the issue here is with the Islamophobia definition, the working definition, which was proposed by the APPG British Muslims, there's a conflation between very real forms of anti-Muslim discrimination and what I'd consider to be perfectly legitimate criticisms of religious ideology and the social implications of particular doctrines. Now, of course, we should be in the business of rooting out all forms of discrimination, whether that's in the labour market, accessing housing, and indeed in our politics. But that shouldn't be at the expense of a poorly formulated definition which overreaches. It's not simply an anti-discrimination instrument. In some ways, I actually find some elements of it risking the suppression of academic freedom, and that's simply not acceptable in our liberal democracy.
I think that's a really important point there, the distinction between criticising individuals and criticising ideas. I'm just going to pause this for a second because I believe we've got a number of people walking out of number 10. I don't know if we can go to Downing Street right now. We'll return to this conversation in just a second, but the Cabinet meeting has clearly just finished, and let's see if we can see any famous faces walking out of that black door. Of course, the Cabinet meeting has gone on for more than an hour this morning. Penny Mordaunt has just popped out of that door, but it is telling that this meeting this morning has gone on for quite some time. Here we go. That is Ben Wallace walking out there, and Robert Jenrick, of course, who was on the media round this morning. Robert Jenrick criticised on this programme just a few moments ago by Anne Widdecombe. But he was walking out there with the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace. As I say, this Cabinet meeting going on for more than an hour, starting at 9:30 and ministers leaving at 10:40. Clearly a much more detailed discussion than we saw last week. Last week it lasted around half an hour. And clearly these ministers have got a lot on their plate. Steve Barclay there and Nadeem Zahawi, that's the Health Secretary and the Chairman of the Conservative Party, walking out. Mark Harper, of course, the new Secretary of State for Transport, former Chief Whip as well. There are clearly party discipline issues here. Grant Shapps there too, who's now the Business Secretary, replaced Jacob Rees-Mogg in the reshuffle. Now we're seeing some more door action there. It is important to note what these people who are running the country have been doing, how long they have been discussing it, and crucially, what sort of government we are seeing. Are we seeing a return to cabinet government, collegiate government, where every minister says their piece and it's a really collaborative affair? Or perhaps is this a more presidential style of government where the cabinet acts as just a rubber stamp? And there we are, the star of the show for the last few days, Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, walking out of number 10 there and getting in to her government car, just saying good morning to reporters there on the street. She will be the focus of a lot more discussion in the days to come. Of course, many scandals involving the Home Office, no doubt the migrant crisis in the Channel, as well as this security issue, the former Prime Minister's phone allegedly being hacked, and indeed the handling of secure documents via a private email address. Two big issues on top of the migrant crisis in the Channel that the government will be facing. So there, as I say, the Cabinet meeting just ended, lasted an hour and 10 minutes there in Downing Street. Let's return now to our discussion on this definition of Islamophobia. And Dr. Rakib Ehsan, thank you for sitting with us while we were going through that. Important to note the timings of these things. I suspect not discussed at that Cabinet meeting was this issue, but this issue remains important. And we were just discussing the difference between the quite rightly criticised attacks on individuals versus the entirely legitimate critique of ideas.
Absolutely, Tom. I think that we should always be in the business of strengthening equality of opportunity in our country, trying to foster a more meritocratic society. But I think that one of the hallmarks of our liberal democracy is freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And I'd say that a classically British tradition is that right of religious dissent, you could say. So, and I really felt that the definition of Islamophobia, what it did is that it didn't really focus on the bread and butter issues of fighting discrimination in the economic, social, political and cultural spheres of British life. It overreached, and I think in some cases it runs the risk of suppressing academic freedom and robust intellectual inquiry on matters of multiculturalism, identity and integration.
And so it's your view that using the term anti-Muslim prejudice in terms of, I suppose that refers to individuals, as opposed to the more nebulous concept of Islamophobia, which I suppose could be critiquing wild claims that may appear in the Quran or elsewhere. That's an important distinction to make. Would you support the government perhaps pursuing this line, stopping using the word Islamophobia and using the words anti-Muslim prejudice instead?
Absolutely. I'll definitely support the government adopting anti-Muslim prejudice and doing away with the term Islamophobia. And as I said, the government should be focused on how to create a fairer, more equal society in terms of the allocation of opportunities, but it should also be in the business of protecting various freedoms, and that includes freedom of speech and the right for people to critique religious ideas and the potentially problematic impact that those ideas may have on social cohesion in modern-day Britain.
Well, Dr. Rakib Ehsan, it's been a fascinating conversation. Always a delight to have you on the programme, and let's hope that some of these ideas percolate their way through government and see what happens there. Clearly a review taking place there in the Levelling Up Department, which handles these affairs. Well, moving on now, the Russian President Vladimir Putin said that yesterday's attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure were in response to a drone attack on the Russian fleet in Crimea. Explosions took place in 10 Ukrainian regions, including in the capital city of Kiev, and damaged 18 mostly energy-related facilities, according to the Ukrainian Prime Minister. 13 people were injured in those strikes. Meanwhile, yesterday, the Foreign Secretary James Cleverly warned the Kremlin of severe consequences if Russia uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Let's have a listen.
No other country is talking about nuclear use. No country is threatening Russia or threatening President Putin. He should be clear that for the UK and our allies, any use at all of nuclear weapons would fundamentally change the nature of this conflict. There would be severe consequences for Russia.
Well, joining us now to talk in more detail about this is Andrei Osadchuk, a Ukrainian member of Parliament. And Andrei, thank you for making the time to speak with us this morning. Clearly a very difficult time for your country after civilian centres being bombed yet again by the Russians. What do you make of this increased animosity towards these centres of energy production? Is this a Russian tactic to try and break the will of the Ukrainian people?
Good morning. Thank you for having me here. Look, first of all, everyone shall remember that it is lasting for 8 months at raw. 8 months, Ukrainian cities are under permanent bombarding of Russian cruise missiles, and for the last 3 months by kamikaze drones made in Iran. So that's reality. You are very right mentioning yesterday's press conference of Putin, where he publicly confirmed that he considers Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and Ukrainian residential areas as a legitimate target for Russian military as a response for Russian combat losses in Crimea and in other places in the temporary occupied territory. Meaning that for Kremlin, it's just normal way of conducting warfare. By the way, they war crime based on international law. Hopefully these statements will be earlier or later joined to Hague Tribunal as one of the confirmation of Russian crimes in Ukraine. Coming back to the will, yes, he's trying to fight with civilians from one side. From another side, his tactics is to kill as more Ukrainian as possible, to push the West to reduce supplies of weapons to Ukraine, that very weapons which in fact limit Putin to kill as much Ukrainians as possible. That's in reality his tactic. But we managed pretty well, despite the huge damage which Kievan infrastructure had 2 days ago. Yesterday morning, I think almost 80% of Kyiv was out of water supply and out of electricity. And please remember that Kyiv is a huge city. It's like, I don't know, 5 Liverpools or 5 Manchesters. So it's, for today, minimum 2.5 million people inside of the Kyiv. But despite all this big dramatic damage till evening, by some magical things, our heroes in utility and services companies, they were able to fix everything. And I'm speaking to you right from my apartment in downtown, and I have electricity, water supply, even hot water supply. Everything is working. But we pay a huge price for that. And definitely we have very limited and melting resources to fix all these things. And definitely Russia will continue these tactics of fight with civilians.
Now, looking a bit wider here, earlier today I spoke with Petro Poroshenko, the former president of Ukraine, of course, who responded to a question I asked about the new president of Brazil. Lula da Silva, of course, elected yesterday as president-elect. His comments had been equating Ukraine and Russia, saying President Zelensky was somehow responsible for this war. Now, this is what Petro Poroshenko had to say in response.
First of all, I want to congratulate Lula with the victory on the presidential election, and I think that now it is a very great responsibility he has on his shoulders in reform and saving Brazil, and in be the influential member of the global coalition. And there is only one place in the global coalition. This is the coalition with Ukraine. And I hope, Mr. Silva, we're waiting for you in this coalition. And my message to him, please remember, victory of Ukraine would be victory of Europe. Victory of Europe would be victory of the world. Victory of the world definitely would be victory of Brazil. No any other.
Now, Andrei Assadchak, what do you make of that, of the comments of Poroshenko there, talking about the comments of Lula da Silva and perhaps Brazil's less than fulsome support for Ukraine? Would you like to see Lula say something different?
First of all, Petro is absolutely right, and I'm supporting this tone of voice and this language. From another side, you see this war is clearly show that distance matters in this world. Unfortunately, it was, it is, and probably it will be, because for human beings who are living in another side of the planet, Ukraine is something very, very far. And believe me, the same for you or for me. I was asking myself many times, what was my reaction to the war in Syria, for example? And honestly, yes, it was some kind of drama, but very, very far from me. So Brazil is very, very far from Ukraine, but it is important. It's easy for understand for regular citizens. But leaders must understand that the world is very, very small. The war in Ukraine is still the answering on the question how much the West is ready to pay to stay the West. Because we are now in confrontation just with old dictatorship regimes, which in fact making a coalitions, because in fact Iran and Russia is now fighting together against collective West in Ukraine. And only if we will able to protect the West, we will have the future which we like. The future will be an extension of our way of life which we have today. So the last comment, yes, for the last 8 months, we built quite robust anti-Russian coalition defending West. But the biggest problem of this coalition that we are very reactive. We are always waiting when Russia is doing something horrible in Ukraine, and then coalition is providing more support, acting more efficiently. I think it's time to be more proactive, not wait for any other attack, not wait for any other atrocities. And when Ukraine is saying that any of our citizens in the threat being on the streets of Kiev or any other city of Ukraine, it means that we need more air defense system. If we say that our people are suffering in temporarily occupied territories, we need more equipment to defeat Russians. We are capable to do that. The only question is military equipment, and that's the question to the West, because again, it's the defense of the West, not Ukraine only.
Well, Andrei Assadchak, always a pleasure to have you on the programme. Thank you so much for your thoughts this morning, and indeed, Slava Ukraini. Well, moving on now this morning, everything with feathers is set to be locked down. Yes, from Russia to chickens. Due to a surge in bird flu, new mandatory housing measures for poultry and captive birds in England are set to be introduced by the UK's Chief Veterinary Officer on Monday the 7th of November. that housing measures are legally requiring all bird keepers to keep their birds indoors and to follow stringent biosecurity measures to help protect their flocks from disease, regardless of type or size. Over the last year, the UK has faced its largest ever outbreak of avian influenza, with over 200 confirmed cases since late October 2021. So what impact will this have on our farmers? And could this affect our plans for Christmas turkeys? Well, our South West of England reporter Jeff Moody is in Sladestown Farm in Newton Abbot to find out. Jeff, are we going to have turkeys this Christmas?
I think we probably will, but there won't be quite as many as we would expect. There certainly might be a shortage. In this particular shed, right now, there should be 1,000 ducklings fattening up for Christmas. It's eerily quiet. There are none left. And in fact, on this particular farm, they've had to cull 12,000 ducklings in the last 6 weeks. Which, as you can imagine, Tom, has had a huge impact on their business. Well, here is the farmer, Daniel. Daniel, what happened?
What happened? I guess with farming, we are working with nature as part of our ethos of the way we do things. And when the bird flu got into the wild bird population, then it's only a matter of time before it shows its face in the commercial flock.
And how many were affected here?
We had a mortality probably of about between 8 and 1,000 birds out of the whole flock. So it wasn't devastating amongst everything, but certainly amongst certain groups.
Because of that, you had to cull your entire flock?
Yeah, the rules from DEFRA are that if you have it on the farm, on the CPH number as well, on the holding, then every live poultry has to be culled out.
And very briefly, if you will, you can't restock yet, can you?
No, so we're on a 12-month lockdown now on the holding before we're allowed to restock with poultry.
OK, for now, Daniel, thank you very much. But we'll be here throughout the morning learning more about this story as it develops. But for now, back to you in the studio.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for that. Really, really important there for anyone who, like me, thoroughly enjoys a Christmas lunch. Well, keep all your thoughts coming in on everything that we've been discussing. gbviews@gbnews.uk is the email to get in touch. We'll be back with all of your views and indeed many more stories after this break.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
To each and every one of you.
For helping our great nation
Find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
across England, Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland.
On TV.
On radio.
And online.
We're proud to be
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flock at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Every Saturday at 2 o'clock, join me, Darren Grimes, for Real Britain. I'm not afraid to give you a platform and say it how it is.
Come on, make the case. Something like this is very, very important to people.
And we're always up for a laugh on this show.
God, honestly, you'd think there were no problems in the world.
Real Britain, every Saturday on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
Good morning, this is To The Point on GB News, live on your TV, radio and online. I'm with you until midday with a show jam-packed, full of all of today's biggest stories, lots of discussion and expert guests. So make sure you get in touch with your views as usual. gbviews@gbnews.uk is the address. We've already got loads coming in, we'll get to them in just a moment. But first, it's time for the latest headlines.
A very good morning to you. It's 11 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date. The Manston Migrant Processing Centre in Kent is fit for purpose, according to the Immigration Minister. Robert Jenrick says the facility's been overwhelmed by the huge numbers of asylum seekers crossing the Channel. Around 4,000 people are thought to be at the centre, which is built to hold a maximum of 1,600. He also defended the Home Secretary after she described the influx of migrants as an invasion, saying the word was used to describe the sheer scale of the challenge. The UK is being warned that household budgets could be further squeezed, with tax rises expected for years to come. The Prime Minister and Chancellor under pressure to balance the books, with up to £50 billion needed to fill a black hole in the public's finances. The Daily Telegraph says a combination of 50% tax rises and 50% spending cuts is being considered. A Treasury source told the paper it's going to be rough and everyone will need to contribute to maintain public services. Meanwhile, there'll be some additional support for people struggling with their energy bills. National Grid have launched a £50 million fund to help individuals over the next 2 winters. The money will go to charities that offer emergency financial support to those using prepaid meters, as well as advice on payments and debt. Well, that energy support comes as BP announces profits that more than doubled in the last quarter. Profits surged to £7.1 billion, compared with £2.9 billion a year earlier. The oil giant also confirmed it will be hit by a windfall tax on its UK operations that it will pay this year. Fireworks were thrown at cars last night in scenes that the leader of Dundee City Council described as absolutely disgusting. Video posted on social media showed young people lighting fires on roads, blocking cars and forcing drivers to go over grass verges. There were also reports of bricks being thrown at vehicles and images of police in riot gear. Councillor John Alexander likened the behaviour to those in a war-torn nation and said it reflected poorly on the Kirkton community. In South Korea, the number of people killed in the Halloween crush at the weekend has risen to 156. Most of the victims were in their teens and 20s. As the country tries to calm public outrage, their families are being encouraged to collect items like shoes and bags that were left behind. The police chief has admitted crowd control in the area was inadequate and said he feels responsible for the tragic event. Voting in Israel is underway for the 5th time in less than 4 years. The country's former Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's on trial accused of corruption, is hoping to return to office. He denies the charges against him. His party is expected to become the largest in Parliament, but opinion polls suggest he'll still fall short of a majority, which could mean more difficult coalition talks. The outgoing Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, has been campaigning on the country's strong economic performance. Farmers are warning turkey supplies could be affected this Christmas following the UK's biggest outbreak of bird flu. They say the current situation is unbelievably bad, describing it as the foot and mouth of the poultry industry. Bird keepers in England will be required to house their animals indoors from the 7th of November to help tackle the spread of the virus. The former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, is reportedly set to appear on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. Well, he resigned in June last year after breaching guidance on social distancing. The Sun newspaper says he's now the 12th star to enter the jungle in Australia. The series starts this Sunday, but Mr Hancock is expected to be one of the 2 latecomers to join the camp. You're up to date on GB News. I'll bring you more as it develops. Back to Tom.
Goodness me, Matt Hancock potentially on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. I would love to see your views on that. So do email in. gbviews@gbnews.uk is the address. Well, this is To The Point on GB News. My name's Tom Harwood and I'm with you on your TV, radio and indeed online. We've got a great show for you lined up over this final hour, taking us right up to Midday. So here's what's coming up this morning. Our top story, Suella Braverman has said she's the victim of a political witch hunt as she defends her record as Home Secretary. Speaking in the Commons last night, she said mistakes had been made in regards to the migrant crisis and the handling of official documents, but she wouldn't apologise for things she hadn't done. Well, as the Home Secretary faces that backlash, many are focused on the looming government's autumn fiscal statement, now due on November the 17th. There are reports today that Chancellor Jeremy Hunt is plotting widespread tax rises and spending cuts to plug a reported £50 billion hole needed to make up this budget. Well, we'll be discussing that later on the show. And yesterday, Just Stop Oil sprayed orange paint on buildings in central London, calling for the government to halt new oil and gas licences. Are the group going too far in their actions? And when is enough? Well, I'll be joined by a Just Stop Oil representative here in the studio. Well, we've got all of that coming up and so much more across the programme, so you can get in touch as usual on GBViews at gbnews.uk. Well, our top story this morning, Suella Braverman has said she's the victim of a political witch hunt as she defends her record as Home Secretary. Speaking in the Commons last night to address both the migrant crisis and indeed her handling of sensitive Home Office documents, she said mistakes had been made, but she wouldn't apologise for things she hadn't done. And addressing the Manston crisis, the Home Secretary said that she was not to blame, claiming she never had blocked the use of hotels to ease pressure on the processing centre there in Kent. She also described the influx of migrants as an invasion.
The British people deserve to know which party is serious about stopping the invasion on our southern coast.
Well, joining us now is GB News political editor Darren McCaffrey. And Darren, this is clearly a big row dominating many of the papers this morning. Do you get the sense that this Home Secretary is perhaps safer in her job than she was yesterday?
In many regards, Tom, I think probably it's about the same. If that's the honest answer. I'm not entirely sure yesterday, in many ways, changed the game. Now, why do I say that? Well, first of all, even though there was those pressures about emails and the timeline of events that led to her initial resignation as Home Secretary under Liz Truss, in many ways, that story is clearly being superseded by yesterday's statement in the Commons. Now, in many regards, it may well have been intentional for Suella Braverman to essentially be quite provocative in the Commons yesterday to ensure that people did not carry on talking about her emails and her initial resignation. In terms of this row, though, in two regards. First of all, about the use of the word invasion when it comes to the number of small votes crossing the English Channel. Let's be clear about this. That was a word very deliberately chosen by the Home Secretary to be provocative. Now, for her and her supporters, and indeed I'm sure for many of our viewers, they would feel that is an entirely appropriate word to describe the situation that has emerged over the last couple of years, but particularly this year's, with numbers hitting 40,000. For others, they will feel uncomfortable by that word, not just outside the Labour Party, but inside too. Robert Jenrick, who's the Immigration Minister, essentially sits in Cabinet alongside the Home Secretary, said that it is not a word he would use. William Hague, the former leader, this morning on the radio, said that it was a word that's more associated with war. It's what Russia's done to Ukraine. Again, not a word he would use. So, in saying that, does this disagreement, does this argument, is it bad for Suella Braverman? I would argue not. She is someone who wants to be seen to be determined to try and sort this out. She wants to be someone who wants to be plain speaking, if you like, who's not going to pussyfoot around the use of words like invasion. And I think politically he'll not do any harm at all. I think where she is slightly in more hot water, if you like, is on this issue about hotels and whether or not she blocked the use of hotels as Home Secretary. This morning there are further reports adding to what we heard yesterday from senior officials inside the Home Office, though we must say they're all unsourced, so no one's actually come out and said this publicly, but with suggestions that she did so because they were going to be in Tory areas. Now, she was
Darren, I'm just going to have to interrupt you there for a second, because we're hearing that Matt Hancock has had the whip suspended from him in the last couple of minutes. This is after we've had it confirmed that Matt Hancock has agreed to appear on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here this year. What more do we know?
Yeah, let me just finish this Suella Braverman point, though, in the sense that I think what I'm trying to say is if it's found out what she said in the comments isn't true, I mean, you know, it really will be curtains again, I think, for the Home Secretary. Yes, Matt Hancock, I was going to bring this up, has decided to go and join Ant Dec and many other celebrities, I think including Mike Tindall. People can correct me if I'm wrong on that. I'm not saying I'm not across the whole lineup of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. But Matt Hancock, the former Health Secretary, is going to go to the Australian jungle as a celebrity, if you like. You know, he's pretty well known, obviously, being Health Secretary during the pandemic. He is not the first MP, or indeed the first Conservative MP to have done this. Viewers may remember that Nadine Dorries did this when she was a Conservative backbench MP years and years ago. Now, he has had the whips withdrawn for what I would understand the reason is because actually lots of this programme is going to fall in parliamentary time, and there'll be people who are slightly disquieted about the fact that you've got an MP who, instead of representing his constituents, which is essentially his job primarily, that he will be earning quite a lot of money and lots of TV exposure in Australia. I assume, not had confirmation from Number 10, I'm sure we'll find out in the coming minutes when lobby is held for journalists here, but I assume that is the reason it has happened. And you know, interesting, I'm sure there'll be people who'll suggest that Boris Johnson, who's also a constituents MP, spent quite a lot of parliamentary time on holiday in the Caribbean, but didn't have the whip withdrawn. We'll have to wait for a response, as I say, from Number 10 and from Matt Hancock, but I suspect that's the reason that he is going to miss out on lots of parliamentary time because he's swanning away to Australia to earn lots of money on behalf of himself.
I should say we've got a brief statement from the Chief Whip, Simon Hart, who has this morning said, following a conversation with Matt Hancock, I have considered the situation and believe this is a matter serious enough to warrant suspension of the whip with immediate effect. As you say there, Darren, no clear statement there as to precisely why, but I suppose we can infer parliamentary time. And a political ally of Matt Hancock has been in touch with a number of journalists. A political ally who I'm sure is not called Matt Hancock, but something very else. Now, a statement has gone out from this political ally to say, I'm a Celeb is the most watched show on TV. Matt doesn't expect to serve in government again, so it's an incredible opportunity for him to engage with the 12 million Brits who tune in every single night. No doubt there'll be more to say on this subject. No doubt it will dominate lobby briefing, as I'm sure you'll be finding out in a few moments' time. Darren, we'll have to catch up with you after you've skewered the Prime Minister's spokesman on this.
I was just going to add one thing very briefly, Tom, which is, aside from that, is that we've now got so many MPs who've literally had the whip withdrawn from not just the Conservative Party, but across the board, that I think if they were all put them together as independents, they may well be start challenging the SNP for the third party. It's quite extraordinary how many MPs this parliamentary session have had the whip withdrawn.
Really, really profound stuff there. Well, Darren, I'll let you go there to that lobby briefing, and please do bring us all of the juicy detail once you have properly interrogated the Prime Minister's spokesman. Thanks for joining us there live from Downing Street. Now, let's get more on this by talking to the political consultant Emma Burnell. Thank you for joining us. First of all, we're going to have to start off with this extraordinary story that few saw coming. Breaking in just the last few minutes, Matt Hancock going into the jungle. What do you make of it?
I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I know there are lots of Tory MPs who are concerned that they don't have much of a future. There are quiet coffees happening all over SW1 with lobbying and PR firms. That's the usual course when you think you might be on the way out in politics. It's slightly more unusual to advertise your services in front of 12 million people on television. But I have to say, absolutely excited about Ant Dec's Hello Prime Minister bumpers, because they're always the best bit of the show and have been since they first started doing it when Nadine Dorries was on. So, I mean, he just looks like, I'm sorry, I think I can use the word prat on this channel, and that's what he looks like. I'm sure he won't look any less of a prat when eating terrible parts of terrible animals.
Nadine Dorries did have the whip suspended from her when she did, I think it was 2012 or 2013, certainly during the coalition government. But she had the most remarkable comeback and ended up as a cabinet minister after all of that and had the whip restored. I suppose Matt Hancock might be thinking, well, if it worked for Nadine, it might work for me too.
I mean, I think the difference between Nadine Dorries and Matt Hancock is that Matt Hancock has been a thing, whereas Nadine Dorries was only a backbencher, was on her way into higher political office, although I would say that at that time nobody really saw that coming. So she was a different kettle of fish in terms of her political trajectory, in terms of her own career. But there are serious questions about how you can represent your constituents. You know, when MPs do foreign trips, they're doing it as part of a fact-finding mission or a trade envoy, or to create better diplomatic relations with another nation. They don't do it so that people can laugh at them eating kangaroo anus on the telly.
I suppose Matt Hancock would say that he's going for more serious issues than eating rude parts of animals. Of course, he does run a dyslexia campaign. He's an ambassador for that. Perhaps he wants to raise that issue there. I suppose we will hear more about this. Of course, it is a developing story as the day goes on. But I think we probably should talk about some of the other substantive issues that the country is facing more than just a former health secretary going on the television. Rishi Sunak seems to be equivocating as to whether or not he will turn up in Egypt for this year's COP27. Now, last year, COP26, the big climate conference, was hosted by the United Kingdom. This coming year, of course, it's in Egypt. What do we know is the latest position of the government on this? We've been hearing many mixed messages.
I mean, that's exactly, we don't know. You know, they may go, they may not go. There's a bit of a hokey-cokey going on. I think it's a shame, really, because while a lot of the climate activism that is discussed on this channel and that I've talked about before is the kind of thing that you wouldn't get involved as a government minister or as a prime minister. That doesn't mean that there isn't real leadership that could be shown by this government. I'm very much open and public about the fact that I'm not a big fan of Boris Johnson, but one thing he did really get right was centering our role in international climate leadership. And when we hosted COP26, that was a really important part of that. And we are still the presidents of COP until we hand it over at COP27. So this is a good chance for Rishi to go along and make some really important leadership statement saying, I'm handing this to you, but this is what we are asking you to do. And I think it's a shame that he hasn't separated out the sense of, climate change is you know, for activists like Just Stop Oil, from actually climate change is for leaders. And it makes him look a bit old-fashioned in a way. I mean, it just isn't the case that climate change is a niche issue anymore.
That I suppose that is true, although many Conservatives have been saying that actually it's relatively rare for British Prime Ministers to attend these. There have been 27 of them. And as far as I'm aware, the last count, I think only 3 times British Prime Ministers have been along. Boris Johnson, of course, in last year, 2015, David Cameron went to Paris and Gordon Brown went to just one when he was Prime Minister. I suppose that is an argument to say that does the Prime Minister really need to go every single year?
I don't think it's necessary every single year, but we are the presidents. You know, we hold the presidency and we're handing it over. It's a great chance for us to take one last go at being international leaders on this while we hold that platform. And that's what I'm talking about. It's, you know, if he didn't go next year, it would probably be a lot less controversial, but not going while we hold the presidency and when we're handing the presidency over is such a missed opportunity. And, you know, they clearly deliberately missed opportunity. So then you ask the question, well, why aren't they going?
That is a pertinent question to ask, I suppose. Emma Burnell, thank you so much for talking us through those big issues. And, of course, the surprising breaking story of Matt Hancock joining the jungle and having the whip suspended. I'm looking forward to, no doubt, what will be a probable hands-face-space challenge or similar as that programme goes on. Emma, thank you. Well, let's get to some views just quickly before we head to a break, because a lot of you have been writing in on immigration. David has said, what else is it but an invasion, with 30 boats a day arriving illegally, with people deliberately throwing away their IDs, funded by people smugglers. And Angela has written in saying, yes, it is an invasion. It's about time people wake up to the fact that we're being taken advantage of. Now, more on migration. Maureen has written in to say, why don't you guys leave Suella Braverman alone? She is right. It's an invasion of our country. Labour will be worse. They will let anyone in. And Sue in Cheshire has said, yes, she is right to describe the illegal immigrant crisis as an invasion. It's the language most voters use. And I have to say, scrolling through all of these views that have come in, it seems fairly unanimous. All people are saying that it is an invasion. Now, if anyone disagrees with that, please do write in and let us know. We'll be delighted to read out your comments too. But coming up, we'll be talking about the economy. On November the 17th, the Chancellor could raise taxes yet further, already expected to reach a 70-year high. How much higher could they go? And indeed, might public spending be cut as well to make up for the billions of pounds needed for this awaited budget? Well, we'll have more details after the break.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here. You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join me, Arlene Foster, for the briefing on GB News. Every Friday at 3 p.m, I'll give you all the latest political news and analysis, and we'll have robust live debate. To make sure that you're caught up on all of the biggest issues of the day, we'll bring on experts in their field. I'll ask the questions that you'd like to ask. We're not afraid to tackle discussions from all perspectives, including yours. Don't forget, the briefing with me, Arlene Foster, every Friday at 3 p.m. on GB News.
Hello, I'm Alastair Stewart, and I'd invite you to join me at noon on Saturdays and Sundays for Alastair Stewart and Friends. I've been in this business for over 40 years. Now, here at GB News, I've never been happier. I get to choose the big stories that really interest me. We hear what you have to say, and you hear what I have to say. I really hope you can join me, noon on Saturdays and Sundays.
It's 11:24. This is To The Point with me, Tom Harwood, and you're watching GB News. We're live on your TV, online, and indeed on your radio as well this morning. Well, as the Home Secretary faces a backlash, many are focused on the looming autumn budget due on November the 17th. Not only is there a crisis in the English Channel, there's also a crisis at potentially English finances, or should that be the finances of the United Kingdom? It comes this morning as papers are reporting that the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, is plotting widespread tax rises and indeed spending cuts to plug a reported $50 billion black hole in our budget. Well, GB News political reporter Olivia Utley joins us for the latest. And Olivia, you're standing there outside the Bank of England, and the Bank of England came under a great deal of criticism for how it's responded with interest rates, of course, independently set from the government. But the new Chancellor is saying that he wants to try and encourage those rates to be as low as possible, and that means potentially a much tighter fiscal policy, potentially spending cuts and tax rises.
Yes, so we're hearing a lot about this £50 billion hole in public finances. It's hard to say where exactly this hole comes from. Rishi Sunak, it's obviously very politically useful for him to blame that mini budget of Liz Truss's. Actually, it's far more likely that this huge hole in public finances is due to that huge energy package which Liz Truss promised and which Rishi Sunak has stuck to. Then how the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are going to fill it. Now, what the Telegraph is reporting this morning is that it's going to be a mix of 50% tax rises and 50% public spending cuts. There are a few options that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have here. None of them are particularly easy. If you want to go into tax rises, obviously we know that the tax burden is already the highest it's been in 70 years. So there are only very few tax rises that are available. One is the rising corporation tax, which has already been penciled in. That's considered more politically palatable than other taxes because people feel that it's not going to hit the individual quite as much. If it's hitting businesses, obviously that it will just feed down through to the individual too. Another option is stealth tax rises, which we hear quite a lot about. What that would mean is freezing the level at which people pay the personal allowance level for national insurance and income tax, and freezing the rate at which people start paying the higher rate of income tax. And if you've got high inflation, then obviously that amounts to a tax rise. Those are sort of the only tax rises which might be sort of politically acceptable. As for public spending cuts, there are a few options. There's the option to cut public sector investment. There are big sort of infrastructure projects which were particularly popular with the Boris Johnson administration, and you could think about cutting those. But the problem is that really undermines the levelling up growth agenda. And so then the other final option is cuts to the public purse, which are very, very difficult indeed, swathing cuts across public sector departments, cuts to education, health, defence. You can't see those being politically popular in Parliament or with constituents at home. So all in all, it's going to be very, very difficult for the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to tighten up those purse strings in the budget next month, but they're going to have to find a way to do it.
Really tricky decisions to be made there. Of course, just over 2 weeks before that will all take place. For now, Olivia Utley from the Bank of England, thank you for joining us there. We'll be following this story very, very closely. In the studio now, Liam Halligan is with us in the studio, our economics and business editor, of course. And just looking at this situation, of course, it's not just the United Kingdom that is in a bit of a problem here. The global economy is slowing down considerably. What's the context? What's the economic context to all of these decisions that need to be made?
Well, it was always going to be a pretty tough economic in-tray for whoever was going to be Prime Minister because, as you say, Tom, the global economy is slowing. Interest rates are going up across the world, not least in the United States, across Asia, trying to push back on this inflationary bubble that followed lockdown with high energy prices and so on. And we're more than likely going to see interest rates go up on the 3rd of November before we get to that autumn statement on the 17th of November. And some numbers have come out this morning that I wanted to highlight before we talk specifically about the budget. These are what we call the PMI indices, PMI, Purchasing Manager Index. Now, these aren't official GDP numbers. They are numbers that derive from surveys of business leaders. And there are PMI surveys for manufacturing, services, the composite overall economy. And the PMI indices for manufacturing have just come out. Now, if this number is below 50, it indicates that business leaders think the economy is contracting from their experience. If they're above 50, business leaders think that they are expanding. And back in June this year, June 2022, the PMI manufacturing index, about a fifth of our economy's manufacturing, Tom, was 52.8.
So growing.
Pretty healthy. September 2022, so last month, 48.4. Contracting. And now today's PMI number for October, these numbers come out very quickly. GDP numbers for October won't come out for months. PMI numbers immediately, obviously we're one day after October, 46.2, so down from 48.4 to 46.2.
A severe contraction.
That's the biggest contraction since mid-2020, which was
COVID,
the depths of lockdown. So, you know, these are survey numbers. They're not official numbers, but they are a very good, what we call bellwether. They tell you where the official numbers are going to go. These numbers won't only be looked at closely in the city and across, you know, driving business sentiment. They'll also be looked at closely by the Office for Budget Responsibility as they pull together that set of forecasts that will really determine and contain the Chancellor and the Prime Minister's fiscal room for manoeuvre on the 17th of November.
But Liam, looking at those numbers and the severe recession that potentially they indicate, what Chancellor in their right mind would raise taxes at a time like this? At a time when the country is going into recession, raising taxes on individuals and businesses would, to most economies, seem balmy, wouldn't it?
Well, those two, yeah, I wouldn't say they point to a severe recession. They probably point to a recession, but these PMI numbers, they're sentiment-driven. They can turn on a hair trigger, but they're the sentiment of people who actually run businesses and decide whether or not to invest, whether or not to keep people on in one of our most employment-intensive sectors, where we've add lots of value to the economy, earn lots of our export revenue. That's why PMI manufacturing, people like me, always look very, very closely at it and try and convey it to a broader audience. In terms of should we be raising taxes, this is where the debate now is. Now, I would say it doesn't make any sense to raise taxes sharply into the face of a recession. We should be doing the opposite. But the conventional wisdom in recent months seems to have been turned on its head, not least because I think Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng tried to do too much too soon in terms of tax cuts, and the market's freaked out. I think, by the way, the market's also freaked out, that's a technical term, because of what the Bank of England was doing, selling more bonds into the market. I think the market's also got unnerved by the fact that the pound was falling, even though that was largely a strong dollar story. Yes. The dollar was going up against all other major currencies, so the pound was falling. We were particularly susceptible to a falling currency because we import lots. Particularly we import lots of energy, which is priced in dollars. So there were various issues that compounded the market panic in the UK that I don't think had all that much to do with Liz Truss's tax-cutting agenda, but which Liz Truss's tax-cutting agenda has been entirely blamed for. So it makes it almost politically impossible to go there at the moment. Yeah. And we seem to be kind of run at the moment by forecasters predicting doom and gloom. That's why I'm slightly pushing back on the idea of a severe recession. I think there are potential big upsides in the UK economy. We are still attracting a lot of foreign direct investment. Unemployment is still low. There is still investment happening.
Well, Liam Halligan, hold that thought, because Sinn Féin are making a statement right now in Northern Ireland.
We tried right up until the 11th hour in which to establish a fully functioning executive and assembly to help people right now, to help them to get through the cost of living crisis, to invest in our health service. Conor, as our finance minister, had prioritised a 3-year health budget that would have seen significant improvement in terms of improving the situation in our health service. But that got to the deadline, and the DUP still continued to block the formation of the executive. The Secretary of State told us that he had a legal obligation, that he would call that election at 1 minute past midnight. And then what we saw unfold last Friday was a bizarre U-turn, the failure to continue in that vein. And we've met with him again this morning. We've asked him a number of questions, as you would suspect. But I have to say, he provided no clarity. He provided no further information as to the U-turn. We're left with no information in terms of what happens next, or at least what he intends to do next. It's very clear he has a legal obligation in which to call an election if an executive is not formed. But he did not colour in the lines today. He certainly did not provide any clarity around what he intends to do next, apart from to say that he's here to meet with people. So I think that the public, again, are left in limbo. I think he's doubled down in that approach again today, and I just don't think that's acceptable. Well, that's a question I think you should put to himself, Gareth. I'm none the wiser today in terms of his next step. He didn't make that very clear. As I said, he didn't colour in the lines. He didn't say what his next move was. But, you can't escape the reality that there's an obligation on him, a legal obligation on him to call the election. Instead, he's created a political vacuum. The Secretary of State did not mention MLA's pay today.
John. Michelle, did he give any indication when he may move to colour in those lines to provide clarity, or are you expecting an announcement, or did he give any information?
No, I believe that we've had just about 20 minutes, 30 minutes with the Secretary of State. I don't believe he provided any clarity. I think that we're further limping on in this limbo period. He's created a political vacuum. It appears to be pandering to the DUP, and both the British government and the DUP have left the public here in limbo and don't know what's going to happen next. And he has a call to make, but he has a legal obligation, and his legal obligation is to call the election. Well, I think the public deserve good government. They voted for it back in May, and the DUP are the only one party that are continuing to block the outcome of the May election, and that's not lost in the wider public. But people are living through the hardest of times. They're living through a cost of living crisis like they've never been through before. We need to prioritise our public services. We need to put money into people's pockets. That's where I want to be. I want to honour the May election. But I do think that in the absence of that happening, then there is a legal responsibility on the Secretary of State, and that legal responsibility is to call the election.
Well, there we have it. Michelle O'Neill, who, of course, leads Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland, stands to be in the position of First Minister of Northern Ireland were an executive to be formed. They're criticising the Democratic Unionist Party for not joining that potential executive, but also criticising the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Chris Heaton-Harris, for ambiguity as to whether or not an election will be called. Of course, the deadline passed last week, Thursday night, Friday morning. The deadline passed for an executive to be formed, meaning the Secretary of State should be organising an election. That has not yet begun, leaving Northern Ireland in a state of limbo without a government and without a timetable for an election. A really curious state of affairs. No doubt more to discuss later on. But after the break, environmental activists Just Stop Oil have sprayed yet more orange paint on buildings in central London. They're calling for the government to halt oil and gas licences. But why are they doing this? And, frankly, is this an organisation just determined to break the law? All that after the break.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akua, on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News.
On Mark Dolan tonight, we have a simple plan, which is to inform, stimulate and entertain in equal measure. It's all about getting your opinions on the national television airwaves. I love my viewer emails, mark@gbnews.uk. So do join me every Friday, Saturday and Sunday for big guests, big opinions and a big presenter. 6'5", don't you know? See you then on GB News.
A very good morning to you. It's 11:40 and this is To The Point with me, Tom Harwood, on GB News. We're live on your TV, online and indeed on your radio this morning too. Well, next today, environmental activists Just Stop Oil have sprayed more orange paint on buildings in central London, calling for the government to halt new oil and gas licences. The activists targeted buildings used by the Home Office, by MI5, the Bank of England and News Corporation. Just Stop Oil have said these buildings were chosen as they represented the 4 pillars that support and maintain the power of the fossil fuel community. But is this going too far to make a point? Well, joining me now is a spokesperson from Just Stop Oil, Laura Johnson. And Laura, 4 pillars of the big oil conspiracy. Why is MI5 involved? Isn't this sounding very conspiratorial?
Thank you for having me on, Tom. No, not at all. We are in civil resistance against the corrupt government that are wanting to licence new oil. We need to stop talking about our methods and start talking about our message. You, as a broadcaster and a journalist, you owe it to your listeners to be telling them the true message.
So your message is that the government is corrupt. Do you have any evidence for that at all?
Oh, certainly. There's lots of evidence for that. They take money from the fossil fuel industry. We have think tanks that are privately funded and they affect lots of government policy. But once again, let's stop talking about this and start talking about what needs to happen now in climate change.
The government has committed to net zero by 2050, something that a lot of people criticise, many people obviously support as well. The government has committed to banning internal combustion engines by the end of this decade. It's committed to funding a huge expansion of renewable energy in this country. Doesn't the government really just agree with you?
Not at all, no. They are ignoring their own advice, their own scientific advice. They're ignoring the UN, and we could move into renewables. Renewables are 9 times cheaper. Right now, people are facing energy bills that are £3,500. With renewables, that could be a £400 bill. What do you think your viewers would prefer more, £3,500 for a bill or £400?
Of course, all of these take time, and I suppose at the time of an energy crisis, the government might be looking at wanting to do everything it can to reduce bills, and some of the fastest things to do that would be to use existing infrastructure, which happens to include the North Sea. Is it really reasonable to expect that we can go immediately, with no transition at all, to move away from all of these hydrocarbons?
Absolutely not. And what we're asking for is a just transition. We've got 8 years left of oil reserves currently in the UK. So that gives us 14 years of a just transition. The biggest solar farm in the UK was built in 6 weeks. So if we put that money in now, we could be giving people cheaper energy now, not licensing new oil, which won't even come into place for the next decade.
Does your organisation do anything to highlight this cause that isn't illegal?
No, we are the last chance saloon. People have been trying for 70 years in a more orderly fashion. Petitions, marches, to do this. Now we're at a critical point in history and we have to use non-violent civil resistance against the government.
Non-violent civil resistance? As far as I'm aware, your organisation has caused criminal damage, it's smashed windows and it's defaced public property, indeed private property as well. By most definitions, that would count as violence against property. Why is it that your organisation is allowed at all if, as you say, it exists solely to break the law?
So non-violence is against people. And at the moment in the UK, we have 100,000 people dying every year because of air pollution. That's 11 people every hour in the UK dying because of air pollution. Breaking, smashing windows is not killing a life. our government is going ahead with new fossil fuels, even though air pollution is killing people. This year, we've lost a third of our wheat harvest, half of our potato harvest, and we're predicted to lose all of our fruit harvest next year. We are currently in a cost of living crisis and a climate crisis. Next year, we will be in a food shortage crisis. And every single week, £236 million of taxpayer money goes to fund fossil fuel infrastructure, even though they don't pay any tax. We're suggesting that money goes into
fossil fuels pay an extraordinary amount of tax. There's a windfall tax of 60% on North Sea oil and gas. How on earth can you say that these companies don't pay tax?
Have you checked the profits they're making at the moment? We've had Shell and BP making nearly £8 billion in 3 months. And are you happy that £236 million of British taxpayer money is going every week to this industry that clearly do not need it when we have people dying of the cold?
This industry is taxed at 60%. That's more than just about any other industry in the United Kingdom. But I do want to draw your attention to the definition of violence as used in the Public Order Act of 1986, which provides that violence includes violence towards violent conduct towards property. Now, that's British statute that's describing violence there. Can you still claim to be a non-violent group when, by the definition set out in the Public Order Act, your group is violent?
Absolutely, because I care more about the 100,000 people every year in Britain that are dying because of air pollution. I think those people are far more deserving of our time and attention. And let's stop talking about our tactics. You know, let's start talking about the issue. As a journalist, how are you going to feel when you look back in 5 years' time and you see the true effects of what's happening to our country and to what's happening to the world globally, and you didn't use your position right now, didn't use your position to tell people the truth?
If you think that the world is really going to go this far south in 5 years' time, that there'll be food shortages...
It's not me. Sorry, can I just interrupt you?
That there will be... Let me just finish this point. If you believe that, where will you stop? Is it going to be spraying paint or trying to deface art or smashing windows, or is your group going to go further than that? If you genuinely believe that lives are at risk, would you not go further in your violence?
First of all, let me just say this is not my opinion. These opinions are backed by the world's scientists. We have been ignoring this science for 50 years, and now is not the time for debating this anymore. It's a real thing, it's happening, and we need action. And Just Stop Oil will not be going away, and until the government say no to new oil licensing, we will be there. And we hope that I'm sure the people listening now, they care about their families and they care about the country they live in. What is more patriotic than protecting the country you love and the people in it that you love?
Yes, and I'm sure protecting those includes keeping the lights on and keeping the heating on too. Of course, the IPCC would disagree with many of the claims of your group, the idea that net zero must be reached in a much shorter timescale than the 2050 that the UN has said, that the scientific consensus of the world has arrived at. But let's hope that your group can find more peaceful ways to deliver your message in the future. I'm afraid we've run to the end of this conversation, but thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me on.
It's been a fascinating discussion there. Let's move on now to Leeds Council, where Leeds City Poppy Day is being held today, involving uniformed personnel from the Royal Navy, Army, Royal Air Force, as well as veterans and supporters, with activities taking place across the city centre, all in the name of fundraising. Our Yorkshire reporter Anna Riley joins us now from Leeds. And Anna, who are you with and what's planned for today?
Good morning, Tom. I'm with Sharon Turton. She works at the Royal British Legion. You might be able to hear there's a band playing at Leeds train station now, and it's all about fundraising, selling poppies, all for the Royal British Legion charity. Can you just tell me about your involvement with the Legion, Sharon?
Certainly. I'm a membership support officer in South and West Yorkshire. Basically, we have branches of the Royal British Legion throughout the counties, and I look after all of them. There's 84 throughout South and West Yorkshire.
And you've tragically experienced firsthand, you know, the loss of war, haven't you?
I have, yes. My husband, Trooper Kristen Turton, was killed in Iraq in 2007 whilst he was serving with the Queen's Royal Lancers. So they were patrolling the Iran-Iraq border in the Maison province, and They were in a convoy of vehicles and his convoy was taken out, basically, the first two vehicles, and my husband was killed instantly.
And that's why, you know, it's when people, you know, think of the Legion and veterans, it's not just people that have served, you know, in the First and Second World Wars, is it?
No, absolutely not. Veterans these days, you say the word veteran and a lot of people automatically think of old men with the blazers, the badges and the berets. Veterans these days can be 18 years old that have been out to Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, all sorts of places, seen active service, and when they come back, they're more often than not, unfortunately, mentally scarred, physically scarred.
And what has the Legion done for you?
The Legion have not helped me as a beneficiary, although I am entitled. I do qualify to be a beneficiary, but the way the Legion have helped me is because I became involved as a volunteer to start off with at a local branch level, and by having that little family at the branch, that helped me get through a really difficult period in my life. So the support, it's the comradeship that when you leave the armed forces or when you leave the community of the armed forces on a military base, you lose all of that when you lose your loved one. That's no longer there for you. So the Royal British Legion provide that comradeship, that support, that friendship that is often missing when you leave the armed forces community.
Thank you for sharing with us, Sharon. So sorry for your loss, but so thankful that there's services like the Legion that will help people. So, yeah, today the Poppy Day is ongoing throughout the day in Leeds City, and it's all about fundraising and helping veterans.
It's a really, really important message, and I suppose people can find poppies wherever they normally would. Train stations used to be my favourite place to find them. But Anna Riley, thank you so much for joining us there, of course, live from Leeds. Well, let's head to another part of the country now, where thousands of poppy petals have been launched from the back of a Lancaster bomber in honour of Britain's armed forces. The Royal British Legion's Poppy Appeal raises funds to help veterans in the years after their service, of course. And in the Lincolnshire Aviation Heritage Centre, the Avro Lancaster is one of only a handful left in Britain and now serves as a symbol of remembrance, as our East Midlands reporter Will Hollis has learned.
Once bombs fell from the Lancaster, now here in Lincolnshire, poppies. Quite a sight, even for 97-year-old Navy veteran Alfred, who watched the war end from his ship in Tokyo.
The Admiral of the British fleet went on board the Missouri to sign the declaration, and we could see in the distance them actually signing it, which was a great honour.
Ahead of Remembrance, the Royal British Legion sells poppies to raise funds for veterans while honouring the sacrifice made by so many in the armed forces. Hundreds of servicemen and women come to the old East Kirkby RAF base for the appeal's launch, including Clive.
I lost a few friends in Aden during my time in 64, 65 with the Coasting Guards, and it was just something that sticks with you.
John is county chairman at the Legion.
We believe that everybody wearing a poppy is remembering. It doesn't matter about necessarily how much money they've put into the pot to raise funds, but it's the wearing of the poppy that counts.
The old base is now a museum and home to Just Jane, one of only 4 Lancaster bombers left in the UK. During the war, more than 7,000 were built and are credited with taking the fight to Germany when Britain was facing defeat.
Despite the sheer scale of the bomber from the outside, inside it's actually quite tight. You can only imagine how difficult it was to walk around in here during a bombing raid above Berlin when you were being shot at. From this airfield alone at East Kirkby, 3 planes were lost on average a week.
Now Just Jane is used for remembrance events and heritage. She can't fly, but drives visitors along the runway. For Ivan, riding the Lancaster today is special.
The photograph you can see is my dad, and he was a frame mechanic, and behind him is a Lancaster which has been crashed. And he was an airframe mechanic, and this was his job, what they call the smash and grab crew. And I'm very proud of it.
Volunteers like Mark spend their time keeping this history alive.
The young ground crews would have charged the brake presses in exactly the same way, because they'd have moved the aircraft around on the ground to the dispersals.
It's hoped that Jane can be restored completely and fly in future memorials. Andrew is manager at the museum.
To come and see a Lancaster running, it's kind of the ultimate way to remember Bomber Command and those that gave their lives. It kind of takes on a whole different atmosphere and different feeling when it starts up and runs, rather than just being held in a hangar static.
Beyond the planes and poppies, Remembrance is about the people who gave their lives and still serve for Britain. Will Hollis for GB News in East Kirkby.
I love the imagery in that little package. Thank you, Will Hollis, for bringing us that story there. Well, just the final few seconds on the programme. Delighted to have the time to speak to one or two more views that have been sent in. And I have to say that some people were not particularly happy we had a Just Stop Oil activist on the channel. Carol has said, please stop giving these idiots time on your channel. They are anarchists. Well, I hope that some of the questions were challenging to that end. And Sean has written in about Matt Hancock, saying, on Hancock, I'm completely useless and can't be trusted. Get me out of here. Gosh, that's not a particularly popular option for Matt Hancock going there. Although John has written in, well, if nothing else, I'll be happy to see Matt Hancock chewing on some frog testicle. What a note to end on. That's been it for me. Next is GB Newsday with Mark Longhurst.
Alex Deacon here with your latest weather update from the Met Office. A blustery day out there, quite as lively as the winds were overnight, but still gusty conditions with some sunny spells, but also plenty of showers. Low pressure systems dominating. One is clearing away that brought all the very strong winds across the far south through the course of last night. Following on behind, we have weather fronts bringing bands of showers into Wales and southwest England. Still some wet weather across the Northern Isles. That'll persist for most of the day, but elsewhere something a bit brighter, but it is still very blustery, especially across southern parts of England and Wales, and particularly near these showers, which will spread into the Midlands and parts of eastern England later. Not too many for Scotland, the east of Northern Ireland, far north of England. Many here will have a mostly dry afternoon. Still pretty mild for the time of year, but obviously it doesn't feel all that mild when the showers come along. And more of these heavy showers around through this evening as well. I don't think anywhere immune from a downpour. Still fairly blustery initially, but the winds will actually ease overnight. And through the second half of the night, the showers die out as well. And so it will turn quite chilly. Temperatures well down into single figures in rural spots. So a fresh start to Wednesday, generally a bright and sunny start for quite a few, but that doesn't last. Another weather system comes in from the west. Fairly angry one this, going to bring some very gusty winds around the coast of Wales, Northern Ireland, northwest England and into southern Scotland. Some heavy rain for